Forget everything you think you know about pirate combat. Cutlasses, brawls, boarding parties. The truth is darker. Under the black flag, the true arbiter of who lived or died on deck was one flintlock pistol. Picture the scene: a moonlit deck, powder smoke drifting through cold Atlantic air, silence broken only by breathing. A cabin boy, barely 15, hands shaking, raises a pistol to the chest of a hardened captain. The captain bears scars from 20 years at sea and a voice that once silenced entire crews. None of that matters now. The boy pulls the trigger. Iron flint strikes steel. A single spark falls. And in that instant, rank, birth, and raw strength dissolve into smoke. Aboard, all men become equal. This is the story of the weapon that made every pirate equal. To understand that shot, we sail back. The Golden Age of Piracy stretched from the 1650s to the 1720s, 70 lawless years. In those decades, the great sea lanes became hunting grounds where fortune favored the ruthless and merciless. The Caribbean, warm and thick with sugar convoys, the West African coast, where slavers followed the trade winds, the Indian Ocean, where Mughal treasure fleets crossed paths with East India Company ships carrying spice and silver. Between these arteries of empire lay the blood-soaked ports, refuges for thieves, murderers, and desperate broken men. Port Royal in Jamaica, once called the wickedest city on earth, half sunk into the sea by earthquake 1692. Nassau in the Bahamas, a shantytown of wrecked timber where pirates ashore often outnumbered honest working sailors. Tortuga, the rocky French sanctuary of Hispaniola, where buccaneers cured meat and sharpened long knives for the next raid. To understand the flintlock, you must first understand the world it entered. Europe's navies were rigid, unforgiving machines. A Royal Navy captain was almost always a gentleman by birth or patronage. His lieutenants, young men with connections. Below them stood the warrant officers, and below them the great mass of common seamen, pressed, flogged, unpaid. They were buried at sea without ceremony. The lash ruled. The rope ruled. Insolence cost a man his skin. Life under the black flag was, in part, a rejection of that order, a refusal to be property. The pirate ship was no democracy of philosophers. It was a floating negotiation between violent men who refused chains. Into this negotiation came a small, ugly, brilliantly simple machine, the flintlock pistol, cold in the hand. Yet aboard these ships, a strange equality was already loading, quiet as powder tamped into a waiting barrel. Consider the paradox. Pirate crews of the Golden Age were outlaws, outside every legal code from London to Madrid. Yet on their own decks, they governed by written articles, each man signing his name beneath the charter. Bartholomew Roberts had articles. Edward Lowe had articles. John Phillips had articles. Every captain, every crew, bound by ink. These documents divided plunder, set rules of conduct, forbade gambling below decks, and specified compensation for grievous wounds. 600 pieces of eight for a lost right arm, 500 for a left, less for a finger. Captains were elected. If a captain led the crew into starvation or cowardice, the men voted him out. They could hoist another in his place. The quartermaster served as counterweight, a shipboard tribune of the plebs. He stood between the captain and the men. In a chase, the captain commanded. In peace, the quartermaster ruled. But what enforced this fragile democracy? Not law, for the law would gladly have hanged them all. Not honor either, for these were men who had already broken every oath a sailor could break. What enforced their strange republic was something colder. Iron, flint, powder. Small enough to hide beneath a coat. Cheap enough for any man to own. Deadly enough to end an argument before it ever began. The answer sat holstered openly across every man's chest. Consider now the anatomy of the flintlock itself. By the standards of its age, it was a marvel of applied engineering, named for its beating heart. A shaped piece of flint clamped tight in the jaws of a spring-loaded arm called the cock. When the trigger released the sear, the cock snapped forward. The flint scraped down a steel plate. Called the frizen, that plate threw a shower of hot sparks down into a small dish, the pan. There a pinch of fine priming powder waited. The powder flared, fire flashed through a tiny touch hole. Inside the barrel the main charge ignited. The lead ball was hurled out at terrible killing speed. Speeds enough to punch straight through wool, through linen, through human skin, and through the bone beneath. To load the weapon was ritual. The shooter first tipped a measure of coarse black powder down the muzzle. Then a lead ball, sometimes wrapped in a scrap of greased cloth or paper, called a wadding. A ramrod then drove the whole charge down against the breech, packing powder and ball tightly together. Finally, priming powder into the pan, and the frizen snapped shut to keep the sea spray out. On a rolling deck in a rising wind, this whole operation demanded steady hands and clear eyes. In battle, it demanded courage bordering on madness, a discipline few men truly ever possessed under fire. The effective range was short, 10 paces on deck, 15 if the shooter was lucky and the powder dry. Beyond that, the ball wandered off, deflected by cross winds and the weapon's own crude, unrifled bore. A trained pirate did not shoot from 30 yards. He shot from arm's length, or nearly so. Across a table in a cabin, across a hatch, across the shoulder of a struggling comrade during boarding. One shot was the rule. One shot, then club or blade. Reloading a flintlock in hand-to-hand combat was impossible, so a pirate carried more than one. 2 pistols on a belt, sometimes 3 or 4 across the chest, slung on silk ribbons over the shoulder like small dark fruit, ready for the fury of boarding. The pistol was expensive. A quality Dutch or English lock cost a common sailor a month's honest wages ashore. But aboard a pirate ship, plunder replaced wages, and every captured merchantman became a potential floating armory. Powder came in barrels from taken magazines. Lead was melted down and cast into balls in the galley. One shot was all a man needed to become dangerous. Now consider the great myth of the pirate weapon. Ask any reader of pirate stories to name the buccaneer's weapon, and the answer comes back at once: cutlass. Short, heavy, single-edged, thick enough to hack through rigging, brutal enough to sever a hand from wrist. It is the sort of every illustration, every film, every wooden toy sold in a harbor gift shop. The cutlass was real, it was carried, it was used, but it did not rewrite shipboard power. The pistol did. Consider what a sword requires: years of practice, knowledge of guards, thrusts, precise footwork, wrist strength, and the confidence born of 1,000 drills under the black flag on rolling decks. A veteran boatswain from London gutters, through naval press gangs to a pirate sloop, mastered any blade rival. He would kill the newcomer in 3 strokes. But the pistol required none of that discipline aboard. A man learned to load, aim, and fire in a single afternoon. A child could do it, a cabin boy could do it, a woman could do it, and did under the black flag. Anne Bonny and Mary Read sailed with Calico Jack Rackham, fighting with pistol and cutlass alongside the men. When Jamaican militia boarded the sloop of Negril Point in 1720, only the 2 women stood ground. The men hid drunk below deck. Pistols in the women's hands, powder in their pants. Fortune favored ruthless, so the cabin boy was equal to the veteran, the pressed farmhand equal to the ship's carpenter. The escaped slave, newly free, was equal to the captain who had once bought and sold men like him. Not equal in skill, perhaps, but equal in threat, the small absolute promise of a loaded muzzle. A captain's authority ended at the barrel of a subordinate's pistol, the quiet, terrible truth of pirate democracy. A tyrant on a merchant deck ruled by rope for decades. On a pirate deck, he rarely survived. Because every man aboard, from the master to the powder boy, carried the same small machine at his hip, and every man knew how to use it. But equality among the ruthless bred a darker arithmetic. If every quarrel could end with a squeeze of the trigger, then every quarrel threatened to end so. A ship that shot itself apart in port would take no more prizes at sea. So the articles evolved. Robert's code, written aboard the Royal Fortune, forbade fighting on board. Every quarrel was to be settled ashore, on the sand of some empty quay in a formal duel, pistol and sword. First blood or death. The quartermaster stood as judge and second. The distance was paced out. The pistols were loaded and inspected. On the command, the two men turned and fired. If both missed, they drew their cutlasses and closed. If one refused to draw, he was branded a coward and put ashore without weapons. This was law, not the law of London, not of Madrid, but the law of men who chose the black flag. Men who needed some structure to keep themselves from murdering each other over rum, dice, or an ill-said word. The pistols themselves became symbols. Blackbeard, born Edward Teach, wore his in a bandolier of silk ribbons. Across his chest, 6 flintlocks, all primed, all charged. Bartholomew Roberts, the great terror of the Atlantic, dressed for battle in crimson damask with 2 brace of pistols on silk slings across his shoulders. To wear pistols on ribbons was to declare, "I have shots to spare. I am not 1 shot dangerous. I am 4 shots dangerous, 6 shots dangerous. 8 shots of death riding on silk across my chest." Yet the flintlock carried a cruel humor. Powder grown damp in the salt air might simply refuse to ignite. The pan would flash, yet the main charge refused. A flash in the pan, surviving into modern English, meaning a moment of promise that leads to nothing. Or the charge could ignite slowly, a hang fire, seconds delayed. A man who had lowered his weapon might find it firing seconds later into the deck, or a friend. Misfires killed pirates too, not always by accident. In the great boarding actions, the pattern was fixed. As the pirate vessel closed with its prize, the men gathered at the rail. Grappling irons flew across. Lines drew the 2 hulls together. At the moment of contact, the first pirates fired a volley of pistols. A cloud of smoke, a dozen or 20 balls at close range into the defenders on the crowded deck. Then the empty weapons were dropped or holstered, and the cutlasses came out. Close, unforgiving butchery followed. Grunts, cries, and the wet noise of steel through cloth and flesh. The sound of pure close-quarters death. That single volley was the difference between a hard boarding and an easy one. A wall of pure terror. A merchant crew that saw a wall of pistol muzzles rising over its rail often surrendered without a fight. And in one cabin, the great equalizer chose its most famous victim. November the 22nd, 1718. Ocracoke Inlet on the outer banks of what is now North Carolina, a lonely, treacherous coastal anchorage. Edward Teach, called Blackbeard, lay at anchor with a small crew aboard his own sloop, the Adventure. He was a man of theater. He wore a long black beard plaited into tails and tied with ribbons. Before battle, he tucked slow-burning matches under the brim of his hat, wreathing his face in smoke and fire. And across his chest, always, the bandolier of 6 pistols, the equalizer he carried aboard every fight. Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy had been dispatched by the governor of Virginia to end him. Maynard commanded 2 hired sloops, the Jane and the Ranger, crewed with sailors from His Majesty's ships. He carried no cannon of note aboard. He would fight this battle at close quarters, blade against blade. At dawn, Maynard's sloops entered the inlet. Blackbeard, warned late and outnumbered in men, chose to fight. He fired his own guns and crippled the Ranger with a broadside of scrap iron and langrage. The Jane came on, its deck seemingly empty. Maynard had ordered his men below to hide. Blackbeard saw thin resistance and closed to board. That was the trap Maynard had set for him. As the two hulls touched, Maynard's sailors surged up from the hold onto the open pirate deck. And here the pistols came into their own. Volley at close range, powder smoke rolling in morning light. Blackbeard himself fought like a nightmare, drinking a toast to Maynard before crossing swords with him. Maynard's blade broke against Blackbeard's cutlass, and the sailor cut Blackbeard across the neck from behind. Even then he did not fall. He drew a pistol from his bandolier and tried to fire. Reports vary, but the accounts agree Blackbeard took 5 pistol balls into his body before he went down. Any one of them would have killed most men in minutes. He also took some 20 cutlass wounds. He fell at last on the deck of the Adventure, hand still on the cock of an unfired pistol. His severed head was hung from the bowsprit of the Jane for the long voyage back to Virginia. A grim trophy, a message from the crown to every free man sailing under the black flag. His death proved the flintlock weapon feared neither reputation nor legend, only powder and a steady hand. What does all of this mean? Once the smoke of battle has finally cleared from the deck, the pirate republics of the Golden Age were not merely the wild fantasies of drunken lawless outlaws. They were, in their brutal way, an experiment in what happens when lethal firepower reaches every common hand. The flintlock pistol was the first widely available personal firearm, cheap, portable, and simple enough for any sailor. The moment every man aboard could kill any other man, the old hierarchies of birth and rank collapsed. Something had to replace them, and aboard the pirate ships, what replaced them was the vote itself. Shared votes on where to sail, shared plunder divided according to written articles agreed by every man. Shared muzzles pointed outward at the king's navies and inward as the guarantee no captain forgot his place. Fortune favored the ruthless, yes, but it also favored the man who could reload his pistol fastest. It favored the man who kept his powder dry through a week of driving Atlantic rain and cold spray. It favored the man who understood that in a world of equal firepower, discipline outweighed the privileges of birth. Naval discipline could not survive equal firepower. This is why officers of Europe's great fleets feared these crews. Royal Navy, French Marine, Spanish Armada, Dutch Fleet, all feared pirate crews far beyond their actual numbers. There were never more than perhaps 2,000 active pirates at the peak of the Golden Age. 2,000 men in a world of empires with millions under arms terrified the wealthiest cities of 2 continents. Because they were an argument, a moving, sailing, cannon-firing argument that a common sailor needed no lord above him. That the lash was not the natural order of things. That the deck could be a republic if armed. Empires understood this argument even when they could not speak it aloud in royal courts or naval dispatches. That is why Woodes Rogers arrived at Nassau in 1718 bearing not only a pardon but a mission. To disarm, to break the habit of the pistol in the hand of every common man on the deck, to restore the older order in which weapons belonged to soldiers and soldiers belonged to kings alone. That fear would echo far beyond the Caribbean into every port and colony the flintlock would eventually reach. The flintlock was a revolutionary machine long before the revolutions of the long 18th century had proper names. It armed the American colonists at Lexington and Concord in 1775 with terrible, republican, unstoppable purpose. It armed the enslaved rebels of Saint-Domingue in the Great Haitian Uprising that began in 1791. That uprising shattered the sugar empire of France and rewrote what black powder could do in enslaved hands. Every popular uprising of that long century leaned on the same simple technology first tested aboard pirate ships. Hollywood, over the last century, has preferred the cutlass, for the sword is cinematic and steel rings against steel. Two men lock eyes across crossed blades. The pistol is undramatic by comparison, a puff of smoke and silence. A body falls. There is no duel of skill, only the sudden and unromantic end of an armed man. Film after film shows pirates leaping through rigging with rapiers, dueling wildly on staircases and around towering masts. The truth behind the myth is quieter and more terrible than any Hollywood duel ever dared to show. Real pirates, when they killed most often with a single close pistol shot and a shove overboard. Sword duels happened, but they were rare exceptions. The pistol was the true workhorse of Golden Age piracy. Walk today into any serious maritime museum, Greenwich, Charleston or Cartagena, and you will find them still waiting. Flintlock pistols with brass fittings gone green from centuries of salt. Powder scars around the touch hole. 1,000 shots have burned the metal. The locks, still functional, still capable of throwing a spark. These are the objects that ended captains, freed cabin boys, armed the strange republics of the Black Flag. One last question remains before we lower the flag on the Golden Age of Piracy for good. If one small machine could dissolve a captain's authority and reduce a hardened veteran's strength to nothing, could make a cabin boy the equal of any man aboard, what became of those who wielded it? Who died last aboard the Royal Fortune when Bartholomew Roberts fell to a burst of grapeshot off Cape Lopez? 1722. Whose pistol misfired that morning? Whose fired true? Whose hand steadied against the rolling deck? How did the chained survivors hauled aboard a British warship remember the weapon that made them briefly free? If you want to know how the next great captain of the Golden Age met his end, keep watching. How Bartholomew Roberts, the most successful pirate of them all, fell in a single unlucky broadside off Africa. The next video is already waiting on the channel. Subscribe and raise the black flag with us tonight. There are more stories beneath the waves, more decks sleek with powder smoke, more articles signed by candlelight. Join the crew and set sail with us. Hit subscribe before the next voyage under the black flag. And remember, under the black flag, the smallest machine of all decided the largest questions of the age. Raise the black flag with us before the next voyage. Fortune